I'd like to encourage you this evening to be turning with me to the 18th chapter of the book of Revelation as we continue in our study of this very encouraging book, a book that gives comfort to God's children, especially as it relates to the children of God who lived in ancient Asia Minor, those 7 churches. In this lesson, we will be talking about the judgment of Babylon. And in the 11th chapter, we talked about that great city with worldwide appeal that was marked for divine judgment. And of course, we know as we go back and we study in the Old Testament, that was Babylon. Well, John, by inspiration, is writing here apocalyptically about Babylon, referring to, as we have noted in this study, to Rome and the situation that was there. It notes here, it says she was figuratively called Babylon the Great to compare her with the actual city of ancient times. And Babylon the Great was another great place of immorality, ungodliness that was going on. The Babylon, as we have noted, concerning John, or that John is concerned with here and his readers, is Rome and the blasphemies that we find within the Caesars, as well as it being a world empire, the known world. In Revelation 18, we continue the description of God's impending vengeance upon the Romans. And of course, this was the cry that we seen previously in Revelation by the 7 churches of Asia. You know, Lord, when are you going to deal with all of those that are persecuting us? Now, I would also say that we could probably, as Christians today, have the same questions in other. I think that's Jesus calling. Y'all ready to go? Everybody not ready to go? Better hurry up. I can't stand not to do that. You know how it is. No, it's probably me. It has been me in the past. I guarantee it. That's all right. Hey, we're still ripping down the road, I tell you what. Talking about Babylon and Rome, ungodliness going on in those places. Even today, when people that are Christians are persecuted, they can take encouragement from this lesson that we find here in Revelation. Because God's going to deal with all of those who persecute his people sometime down the way. Now, as we noted just a moment ago, the chapter 18 is a form of prophetic literature called a doom song. And that's very commonly utilized in the Old Testament. In Isaiah chapter 13, we find the doom song of Babylon in verses 19 through 22. In Isaiah chapter 34, verses 11 through 15, we find the doom song for Edom. And then if we go over to the book of Zephaniah, chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, we find the doom song of Nineveh. And in each of these cases, these great cities are described in vivid poetic language, and it is utilized with this apocalyptic speech or wording. Here, just as a careful student of the Old Testament should expect, we have the doom song for Rome. Rome is going to fall. It is a reality. And it's very interesting as we look at the first couple of verses, how this is utilized in the present tense. It's something, or in the past tense even, noting that this is something that has happened. And I will explain a little bit how that fits into the certainty that Rome is going to suffer what they have put out, the persecution concerning the Christians. In Revelation chapter 18, starting there in verse 1, it says, "After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory." That is a passage that's just full of God's truth given to us in apocalyptic language. Although we don't know the time that elapsed here, it could have been days or months or even years, the chronology is in order. And this angel announces the fall of Rome that's already occurred. In other words, past tense. So Rome is going to fall. Even though they may not see it right then, it's going to fall. They're going to deal with the situation that they have put themselves in, talking about Rome. Now, a prophetic custom that presupposes any prediction of God to be as good as done. That's what it notes here on our outline. This is going to happen. And the angel announces the fall. It's going to happen. In verse 1, it reconfirms that this message of doom, the judgment that it relays, are from God. God will deal with all of these persecutors of Christianity. Now, it is noted that this angel was so recently come from the presence of God that at passing, he brings a broad belt of light across the darkness of the earth. If you look back at verse 1, it notes, "And the earth was illuminated with his glory," talking about God's glory. So he had been in the presence of God. This stuff was going to happen. It was going to take place. As we move into verse 2, it says, "And he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit, and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird." Well, we see the same connotation in Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 8, where it says, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." And Babylon did fall. And you go back to Daniel and you can study a lot about the fall of Babylon, which brings to light the things that are happening here with the children of Israel, the Christians, the children of God, that Rome is persecuting. It notes here in our outline, in verse 2, that message is repeated. And once again, the present tense is used to stress the certainty of the event. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. We go back to here and it says, "He cried out with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become the dwelling place." And then he enumerates those things here in the 18th chapter of the book of Revelation. Well, in like matter, over 100 years before the actual fall of ancient Babylon, it is noted in Isaiah chapter 21 and verse 9, "Babylon is fallen, and all the graven images of her gods he hath broken unto the ground." So back in Isaiah, it deals with all of these things. In verse 2, it goes further and tells us that the city has, past tense, become a dwelling place of demons, foul spirits, and every foul and hateful bird. Now, this description is very different from the holy city that we see in chapter 21. Because in chapter 21 and verse 27, it tells us, and nothing unclean and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. Of course, this is a picture of that heavenly abode that we're all looking forward to. Here in Revelation, it's talking about how horrible, how bad things are in Rome. And like I have many times in our study of these lessons, I encourage you to go back and look at some historical writings and just see how horrible things were in Rome. And the things that were being propagated, the things that were occurring, and sadly, our world today is not a whole lot different. A lot of the things that was going on in Rome, it's happening in our world today. And there are people who are promoting the ungodliness, the dwelling place of demons, of foul spirits, the foul and hateful birds are in our world today. And they promote this stuff and they try to squelch Christianity. So don't think persecution is for another time. We too face it. In chapter 21, verse 27, again, we're talking about that beautiful place called heaven. There's not going to be any of those things that's noted here in verse 2 of chapter 18. The language, of course, denotes utter devastation and utter desolation. That is, it meant in Isaiah 13 about Babylon. It means here about Rome. It's just horrendous. In verse 3, it says, this is Revelation 18, for all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passions of her immorality. And the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her. And the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. Now, that's a mouthful whenever you really look at it. Rome was the preeminent empire of this time period. The immorality committed by her, by the kings of the earth, is not only the habitual sexual immorality that was going on, but also the whoredom of political alliances, that Machiavellian compromise. And if you don't know what Machiavellian compromise is, that's your homework. You get to figure that out. That's why I left it in here. You don't know what that is, and I'm not telling you. So, you can Google it. We used to Google it. I remember back in the day, we had a set of encyclopedias that everybody had at home, and they were probably 20 years out of date. Then we had Google. Now we have, what they call it? GP? Chat GP. Man, Chat GP don't know nothing. I want to tell you right now. Be careful of encyclopedias, Google, Chat GP. Always check that stuff out. Rome was a great military and commercial power, and Rome enticed other nations to follow her wicked ways. And they would go into a nation and conquer it. They would put individuals from that nation in places of power to keep the nation under control, but yet Rome was over it and they could control it not only by the military power, but by the commercial powers that be also. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a moment. Rome was powerful and arrogant and openly boasted of her abominations. They weren't keeping it under wraps, the things that were going on in Rome or across the Roman Empire. It was out in the open, kind of like we see things becoming more and more in the open in our world today. It notes here we are reminded of the destruction, or the description given in Isaiah 10, verses 12 through 14, of the arrogant boasting and haughty pride of the king of Assyria, who says in verse 12 of this passage, "So it will be that when the Lord has completed all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the pomp of his haughtiness. For he has said, by the power of my hand and by my wisdom I did this. For I have understood, and I removed the boundaries of the people and plundered their treasures. And like a mighty man, I brought down their inhabitants, and in my hand reached to the riches of the peoples like a nest. And as one gathers abandoned eggs, I gather all the earth, and there was not one that flapped its wings or opened its beak or chirped." Well, that's Isaiah 10, 12 through 14. The Assyrian king said, look, I am the preeminent. We also see that with Nebuchadnezzar over in the book of Daniel. He thought he was preeminent, and he ended up eating out with the cows and kind of got a mind change. So this was the situation that they see Rome in. They were powerful. Rome had this same attitude. We're powerful. We're running the show. We're not going to let go of any of our power. Well, here in verse 3, it notes in the last part, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensualities. That's important. The merchants of the earth. That's, again, talking about the known world, the Roman world, if you will, at this time. Well, you know, if you're making money, you're happy. Even if you've got to deal with Rome. And in all the churches of Asia, the 7 churches of Asia, they were very wealthy because of the Roman commerce that was going through. We talked about all of that back when we talked about the 7 churches of Asia. Not only within this group of lessons, but also in a previous group of lessons that we had specifically on the churches of Asia. It notes here, as we like to say today, if you want to understand something, that just follow the money. And that was a key factor. They would deal with Rome. They would live under Roman rule. They would live in all this stuff as long as they were getting the money. So follow the money in the first century. It ended up with Rome. It was money that kept the emperors in power because it was money that allowed them to keep the army happy. And no emperor rules very long when the army's not happy. So money is a key factor. Has anything changed in our world today? It's money. Money's what keeps things going. You know, if I get my part of whatever it is out there, if I get my money and I get my wealth, you know, doesn't matter what we do as long as I get my part. Well, it was the Roman money that fueled the fires of the Romans' power and Rome's persecution of the church. And God has included the merchants in this judgment of Rome. The merchants, as we will see in this chapter, are going to have some difficulties. They're not going to like it when Rome falls. Why? Because the money dries up. If money dries up, people that are receiving that are not happy. They get very unhappy very quickly, and we'll get into that as we continue through this chapter 18. It says, then as now, much and perhaps most of the misery of the world can be traced to greed. Well, we see that in our world today. You know, if I can't make money, I will steal it. If I can't steal it, I will defraud somebody else from their money. And anybody ever get a spam call that's around here? We get spam calls all the time. I tell you what, my phone is set to eat them, which I like. Now, I like spam, the other kind of spam. But the thing about it is that a lot of these spam calls that we get is fraud. People wanting to get in our pocketbook. Money. It all boils down to money. It notes here in our outline then how much and perhaps most of the misery of the world can be traced to greed. While the Christians are denying themselves, the Romans were denying themselves of nothing. They had it all. I mean, it was a very wealthy empire. Even in Asia, not just in the city of Rome, but in Asia. All these they were making money big time and all the stuff that was going on. Well, in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 10, it reminds us, for the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some covet after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. The key of that passage is the love of. They put money over godliness. And that was Rome. Money was of the utmost importance. In verses 4 and 5, it says, this is Revelation chapter 18. I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive her plagues. For her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. A warning. This is a warning. Now, another voice came out of heaven calling the saints to flee the embrace of Rome as Abraham fled Haran and Lot fled Sodom. It's also like what we saw with Moses, that Israel complained about Egyptian bondage had reached the ears of God. So the angel here is assuring John that the church's cries from Roman bondage has touched him as well. God's hearing. He knows. He says, I've heard the voice from heaven. I've heard you. This is going to happen. Well, in verse 4, God calls his people to come out from the city. And the reasoning is, lest they follow Rome's evil example and share in Rome's destruction. In other words, to be separate and apart from. Not literally to extricate yourselves from from Rome itself. I mean, you've got to live in the society, but you don't have to involve yourselves in the sins that are going on in Rome. And when we talked about the 7 churches of Asia, one of the things that was going on was when a person became a Christian, he could not be involved with the pagan religion of that community. He no longer was going to the temple. He was no longer going and involving himself in the activities of his, I can't think of the word right off the top of my head for some reason, the employment group that he was involved with. They had to, if you were a silversmith, you was with the silversmith group. Or if you was a baker, you was with the baker group, or whatever it might be. And they would cut you off. The Christians were cut off from being able to work, feed their families, take care of their needs. And of course, they were moving away and they were struggling. Well, this boils down to, come out from her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins. They're not participating in the sins of Rome. And that made them different. And that's as applicable today as it was in that time period. We do not, as Christians, participate in the sins of our world, the world in which we live in. Well, this call was one that has been made many times throughout the Old Testament. It was that which Lot heard over in Genesis chapter 19, going down to verses 12 through 14. Lot was not part of what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. Don't be a part of this. We see Moses heard this in Numbers 16, 23 through 26. And it was the call of the exiles in Babylon. They heard this many times. Isaiah 48:20, go forth from Babylon, flee from the Chaldeans. Jeremiah 58, move from the midst of Babylon, go out from the land of the Chaldeans and be like the rams before the flock. Jeremiah 51:6, flee from the midst of Babylon. Jeremiah 51:45, my people go out from the midst of her, and let everyone deliver himself from the fierce anger of the Lord. That goes right back to what we're talking about here. Don't allow the influence of Rome to overtake you. And they're still living there. But don't let the influence of the world overtake us. The Christians in Rome were not being told literally to flee the city, but to look forward to something better. And that was that heavenly abode. God is simply telling them to live righteously. It was Paul that told us in Colossians 3, verses 1 and 2, therefore, if you've been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. And set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on the earth. And we have to live in this world, just like those people in the first century had to live under Roman rule. But we don't have to be involved with all of these ungodly activities that's going on here in this situation. Consider this. This cry and challenge to come out does not involve a coming out at a definite moment. They imply a certain aloofness of spirit maintained in the very heart of the world's traffic. They describe the essential apparentness of the Christian from the world. Christian is not to be conformed to the world, but be transformed from the world. We live in it, but we're not part of it. We have to deal with it, and we have to be careful, lest we be influenced into falling prey to that situation. It is not a question of retiring from the world. It's a question of living differently within the world. And as Christians, we live different. And the same thing was in that situation? Well, in verse 5, it tells us of Rome's sins were piled as high as heaven. And again, I encourage you, go back and look at some historical references to what was going on throughout the Roman Empire. It just terrible. The things that even the Caesars, especially, maybe I should say it like this, especially the Caesars were involved in. It was horrendous. And even some of their wives, the things that they did, and is recorded in history, is atrocious. And that is just the immorality part of it. Much less thinking about all the people that were drug into the Colosseum. You know, think about that a minute. Why were those people taken to the Colosseum and thrown in there to be murdered? Why? Huh? Entertainment. That was exactly it. Entertainment. And that's kind of a sad entertainment. But if you compare some of the entertainment of our world today, how vulgar and nasty is it? Of recent. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. Well, it was I saw the lyrics in English of what was being presented last Sunday evening. And I will not share that with anyone. You'll have to go find it yourself. And it was nasty. Or anyway, that's in my deal. The sins were just horrendous. And then you think about the Romans going and the Roman army, what they did when they took over a city, when they took over an area of country, was horrendous. It was a bad deal. And then you throw in all the pagan gods, and you throw in emperor worship, and they were lighting the Appian Way with what? The bodies of Christians. They would put them up on a pole and set them afire at night. That was their light poles. That's awful. Well, Revelation 18:5, for her sins have piled up as high as heaven. Let's look at the last part of that. And God has remembered her iniquities. You know, God's long-suffering, but there does come a point sin reaches a level that's intolerably high and judgment falls. We could reference the Great Flood, when only 8 people made it through the flood alive. Every person in the populace had sin that was intolerable. In Ezra chapter 9 and verse 6, Ezra said of the people of his day, "Oh my God, I am ashamed and embarrassed to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen above our heads, and our guilt has grown even to the heavens." Again, Revelation 18 is encouraging to the Christians who, as it notes in here, have left Rome. They're not involved with what's going on there. And that's the key factor, is being faithful. We overcome. The problem is seen right here. Is sin is so prevalent that it is intolerable. I want us to start there at verse 6 next Wednesday evening, if the Lord wills. And we will talk a little bit about how Rome looked at itself. We'll also look about the situation with the merchants and what's going to happen when Rome falls. And in all of this, compare these things that's going on to our own world. Because we see the same thing going on. Even in some instances, horrendous persecution in our world. And it could be right around the corner, even here. So we'll talk a little bit more about the fall of Rome, the great Babylon, next Wednesday evening, if the Lord wills.